Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moriano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is happening, Roger Moriano? Hello.
Hey, Maria Marukian, how are you?
I'm doing great. It is the fall, and it's my favorite season. So I am very much enjoying the chilly weather, especially in the morning, and the leaves starting to fall here in Washington, D.C. So yeah, all good.
Well, that's
How about
awesome.
you?
I'm doing really, really well, and I am super excited. Do you know why
What are
I'm
you
excited?
excited? What are you excited about?
I'm excited because our conversation with Lisa happened in real time, but it was 2 different days. And that is so cool to me. So it was
That is
very,
such
very
a
exciting.
Yes, that is such a good point. You were definitely, I think, in the middle of the space-time continuum. So, and that is because our guest this week, Lisa Mulligan, is based in Auckland, New Zealand. And so we were having a conversation with her on a Tuesday afternoon, but it was Wednesday morning where she was. Mind blown.
Yeah, I was really excited. And I did ask her at the end of our conversation to predict how the rest of Tuesday would go. And so I was happy to report that her prediction was right and it went
It
really,
was
really
accurate.
well.
Oh,
Yeah, it was good.
excellent. Good,
Yeah.
good. So, Lisa Mulligan is the founder and director of the Culture Ministry, and she is also a podcast host herself. Her podcast, A Dog Called Diversity, is really all about telling people stories about being different in the world, building understanding and kindness. So much of, a lot of similarities to what we do in our podcast and in our work. There were a number of different, I think, areas in which we just sort of all synced up together. And one of the things that was really wonderful from my frame of reference in our conversation was being able to identify the universality of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and also the importance of recognizing some of the subtle cultural nuances that exist when we are trying to do this work and engage people on these concepts, from one culture, from one country to the next. So yeah, what did you take away from our conversation with Lisa, other than the fact that she can predict the future for you?
Yeah. So, yeah, Maria, I think what really stood out and why I appreciated so much of what Lisa had to offer was that she really seemed to really grasp clearly the challenges to this work and why this work is so important. And I found it interesting that a lot of what she had to share resonated and was similar to what we experience when we do DEI work in the US as well, right? But I also appreciated the distinct differences that are present in her work, overseas and in Asia in particular, and some of the challenges that are there, right? And some of the roads that we can or can't go down. So I was really, connecting with her on that. And I also found it fascinating that the challenge of connecting with leaders and leaders saying that they want you to do this work and then not providing the resources and the power and the connectivity and the ability to do the work was something that is apparently very common around the world when it comes to this work, that folks ask us to hold a mirror up to the organization to really find the deep issues that are there, and then not liking what they see, they kind of don't allow you to do the work. So her ability to communicate that was really I think heartening in many ways, because it really was a validation of what a lot of us experience, but it also demonstrates a lot of the work that still needs to be done in this profession and how we can move forward. So I was just very, very happy with what she had to share. And I think, she's obviously doing some really good work.
Absolutely. And with her decades of experience in human resources, working within international conglomerates, her background in organizational change and development, as well as DEI work, I think she's such a powerhouse in terms of the experiences and the anecdotes that she can share. And certainly, as you said, a lot of similar challenges, a lot of reactions that we are accustomed to hearing in our US based DEI work, the deflection is real, folks. And so I loved the ideas and the techniques that she is applying. I think again show that when we are bringing the mindset of embedding DEI concepts and principles into the organizational culture, and when we ensure that people in the highest positions of leadership and power are fully engaged, committed, and accountable for the work, that's where we see progress happen. It doesn't matter what culture you're in, what country you're in, what specific dimensions of identity are at most play. Those are the core foundational elements that have to be a part of this work in order for progress to be made. So really excited for you all listeners to listen and gather some wonderful insights from Lisa Mulligan. Tune in, and also tune into her podcast, A Dog Called Diversity, if you have some time. Welcome, Lisa Mulligan, to the Culture Stew podcast.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's great to be here.
Yes. And well, we'll be getting into talking about this, but you are a fellow podcaster as well as DEI practitioner. So I had the pleasure of being on your podcast not too long ago. So it's so wonderful to be able to return to the seat and be able to interview you now. So welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's I always forget how, it's a bit nerve-wracking being in the seat where you're organized instead of being the interviewer. So yeah, I forget.
We'll be gentle with you, I promise.
Thank you.
So I always start with the same question, just to give our listeners a little bit more of your backstory and hear a little bit not only about what you do, but who you are and why you are. And so when you think, Lisa, back to your childhood, some of those messages that really shaped you early in your life, what comes up for you? The messages that have perhaps had a significant impact on your identity, on the way that you show up in the world, on your perspectives of the world?
Look, it's such a good question. And I don't know if many of us actually think back and what were those messages we grew up with? For me, I think there were two things. I grew up on a dairy farm in country Australia. And, the messages that I got from that, they were not explicit, but they were all around me. So I watched, my parents get out of bed every day and work. When you have a farm, particularly with animals, you can't be sick. You can't not show up. You've got to get up and milk the cows in the morning. And then you've got to milk the cows in the afternoon. And you've got to fix the fences if they get broken. So, I grew up in a family with this work ethic, which was you always show up and you always have to do the job. And throughout my career, for many, many years, I thought that was such a great message. And, to have that work ethic and to always be able to show up and do what you need to do. I always thought that was a great message and was a real strength of me until I went through a little bit of a tough time at one point in my career, and I actually went to see a psychologist, and she said, well, how does that messaging that you're telling yourself, how does that hinder you? And I had never thought of that. And it was a massive hindrance at times. If you keep going, if you are always on, if you're always doing the work, then you burn out. And so that was one of the messages, I guess, that was both a blessing, but also a curse. And I think the other message that was explicit, and I can remember my father and probably my mother to an extent, always saying you can be and do whatever you want in life, as long as you're willing to work for it, right? And I think that kind of sowed this seed of maybe confidence in that actually you can give anything a go and you can try anything. So I guess that teamed with work really hard, always show up, I think were the things that really informed what I do.
That really resonates with me, particularly the notion of not just hard work, but to never be still, to never
Yeah.
be off.
Always be
and
doing something.
always be doing something, produce.
Yeah.
And sick, you're not sick. My parents were both teachers, and also very, very much came from both immigrant as well as farming backgrounds.
Yeah.
My dad was a refugee, and my mother came from a farming community. And so very similar messages in terms of, unless you are just absolutely disturbing
On your
the
deathbed.
soul, you are going to school, you are going to
Yes.
work, right?
Yes.
It's just you never turn off. There's no such thing. So yes,
No.
and absolutely. I mean, that there's such a power to having that work ethic and knowing that we can push ourselves to limits that maybe we didn't anticipate, and yet it also can be very detrimental in certain situations. So that really resonates
Yeah.
with me. I've
Oh,
had
good.
similar conversations with psychologists, with my own therapist about that, so I get it. How do you think those messages have influenced your professional path, Lisa, and the work that you do today?
Look, I think they've had a huge impact. And even as you were just talking then, I was thinking about, running your own business. It means that you don't stop. I work on the weekends. I'm always doing, if I'm sitting on the lounge, I'm thinking, what could I be doing in my business? So that is quite a challenge. And I was even thinking about when I took maternity leave when I had my children. I was living in Australia at the time. In Australia, you can take up to 12 months unpaid maternity leave, and you can even request longer. And I know that's different in the States where you both are. But I didn't know what to do with myself, and I was bored. Yeah, so it's had a big impact. And I think it's also meant that as I saw opportunities, I worked really hard to get them. And I had in my head at different times in my career where I wanted to be next. Didn't know how I was going to get there, but had always this, well, if I just work really hard and, think carefully about how I'm doing things, I should be able to get there. And that's certainly proven to be true for the most part. Yeah, and I think it's carried into, I've always worked in the corporate world. I've always had that security of a regular salary. And I think that work ethic and that message of you can do whatever you want as long as you're willing to work hard enough translates into a business as well, which is much more risky. I don't get a regular salary, which at times is very stressful, I think is the word. So it's kind of translated into that, having a bit of confidence to be able to step out of something very secure and give something else a go.
Well, I'm curious, Lisa, and just hearing
Yeah.
you and Maria talk about the influence of your family certainly resonated with me as well. I also have a father who was a factory worker, and he was all about the hard work ethic, right? But to the points you've all made, at a certain point in his life, it was to his detriment, right? The burnout, the health issues, and so forth. And I think we have to pay attention to kind of how these realities inform us, what they can do to guide us and to provide us with great foundations, and at the same time pay attention to the full picture, right? And I'm curious, in terms of your full picture and your professional journey, what led you to the work that you're doing today, specifically with the creation of the Culture Ministry, the Culture Club, the way you serve your members there, and the work that you do specifically that led you to diversity, equity, and inclusion? How did that path manifest for you?
Yeah, so, I said most of my career has been in the corporate world, and in pretty big global organizations, but very, I would say, male-dominated and industrial kind of organizations. So I have rarely worked for any company that you could say was sexy or had a really, great brand in the market. I've always worked for the organizations that are, not well known to the average person. And so I always had this, I was always a woman, surrounded by men, often the only woman in the room. If I was in a leadership team, I'd be often the only woman. There might be one other. So I guess really noticing that. And, a lot of my career development was, how do I navigate this world? Like, how do I how do I get into those positions I'd like to be in? How do I influence, the men I was working with who were fantastic people, but, how can I shift and move the organization by providing more opportunities, particularly for women at that time? And, I found myself at different times wanting to do something outside of, my day job. So I've run public events for International Women's Day just because I didn't have any event to go to, so I created it myself. I've got a blog called I Develop Me, which was all about how do we help women in their career and how do we keep them in the workforce? How do we ensure they progress? All those things, which I think there was this sense of fairness that was built into me. And I was in human resource roles. So at different times, we were thinking about how can we make the organization better? How can we change the culture? And often that was about bringing different people in. I probably didn't think about DEI work as a real career until I joined a global engineering business and they had someone in that role. And it was like the first time I'd ever realized you could do this full time. I'm like, what? How cool is this company that they have a person that does this amazing work that gives opportunities to women and maybe opportunities for underrepresented ethnicities or people with disability? Like, how cool is that? And at the time, I've got two boys. My older son is now 14. He was a bit younger then, and he has a condition called albinism or ocular cutaneous albinism, which means he doesn't have any pigment in his skin, his hair, or his retina, which means he is vision impaired. So I had a little bit of an understanding about how someone with a disability navigates the world or not, as the case may be. So, I came to this organization. I'm like, they've got a diversity and inclusion role. That is amazing. I'd love to do that role. I felt like I could do it because I had this experience of being a woman. I've got a child with a disability. So 2 years after that point, that person left that role, went to another business. I was very much, who would leave such a cool role? Like, how amazing, right? Yeah. And so I applied for the role. I got the role. I was really passionate. Of course, I got there. I thought I was going to change the world. I thought I was going to change the organization, thought I was going to have a real impact being able to influence leaders, until I got into the role and then realized why these roles are so challenging in organizations. I wasn't allowed to speak to the CEO. I'm like, what? I was the global head, diversity and inclusion, not allowed to speak to the CEO. I couldn't access the executive team. A whole lot of challenges, I guess, that came with it. And also got to understand while the work is great and when you can make progress, it's so heartening. But most of the work is pretty hard slog and it's emotional work. So yeah, very challenging. So it was a really long story about how I got there. But I think it was, I never realized that you could work full time in this space. And it probably wasn't until George Floyd was murdered that the parts of the world that I work in, so I was in Singapore at the time, and across Asia, that companies realized, actually, we don't just have challenges in the US, we actually have challenges all around the world. And so we need people to work in that space.
Oh, I think probably, just first and foremost, Roger and I can both sympathize with the experience of being given this position within an organization to lead DEI efforts and feel like, all of our passion can finally be put toward this great progress, and then have our efforts stifled. And so I think you really hit on something so incredibly important for organizations and particularly senior leaders to keep in mind, that if you want to actually see progress toward DEI, the people that you're putting in charge of the DEI efforts have to have a seat at the table, have to have direct access to the CEO, and that the CEO and pretty much everyone in the C-suite needs to see themselves as actively engaged and a part of this work, rather than sort of just pushing it all off on the shoulders of the one person who's got the position
Yeah.
as DEI, right? So
yeah. And I had an
yeah.
epiphany as well, because it was a really big company, only one person doing this work. And I very quickly, because I thought the organization was great, that they had this role, they really value this work. It was soon evident the only reason they had one person was because they were listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Some of the listing rules say that you have to report on gender. You have to report on your gender percentage for the whole population, for the executive team, your board, and senior leaders. And you also have to do gender pay gap reporting, both in Australia, in the UK, and we're starting to see other countries do that. So a lot of that is a lot of work. So, I came in thinking, oh, what an amazing company. They really care about this stuff too. Actually, I'm pretty sure they've only got the role because it's a compliance thing. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty tough.
For anyone who's listening to this and you can't see our video, we're all sort of like wrinkling our noses right now and nodding in solidarity with each other.
Yes. Yes.
So in terms of, and I do want to come back to something that you started to share with us in terms of on a global scale, how some of the significant catalytic events that took place in the United States, in particular in 2020 with the death of George Floyd and the murders of so many other unarmed civilians, led to this sort of global uprising and focus on this. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your DEI journey. And in particular, Lisa, I know, having shifted more to your own consulting organization, you've created so many different powerful opportunities for people to engage, right? The Culture Ministry, the Culture Club, your podcast, A Dog Called Diversity, which I know there's a story behind that name. So can you share a little bit more with us about that portion of the journey, and what has that allowed you to provide and explore that you didn't have access to when you were working within these corporate conglomerates?
I guess there's a couple of things. So for me, working in, a big conglomerate, you have to work within the boundaries of how that conglomerate needs to operate or wants to operate. And I think, ultimately I got really frustrated that the ability to get stuff done was really hard. And it wasn't necessarily that leaders didn't care. I think when I was there, we'd made a lot of progress. There were, events that accelerated DEI work. Certainly George Floyd, certainly the pandemic. And then, pressures from major shareholder groups, from the board, so pressures were coming from a range of places, which was helping, make the work a bit easier, but it was so slow, and it would get caught up in the machine. And, that happens in big organizations, and there's so much going on in big organizations, like so much, and everyone's vying for their part of their piece of the organization to be the most important. And so because of that, it was hard to get stuff done, I think. And, I had a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit. Probably about 5 or 6 years before I started my consulting business, I'd actually accepted a promotion to move from Singapore to the UK. I was there for a couple of months and my role was made redundant. And I had moved my whole family. Anyone who's packed up their life in a 40-foot container and sent it across the ocean to unpack it all, get settled, get kids in school. I'd also moved my mum and dad. They'd come from Australia to live with us. So, and to lose my role at that point, and it was a huge complication with visas and whether we could stay in the country. There was all these different things. And mentally it was a terrible time. And like, I had this realization, I just didn't want to be at the hands of someone else being in control of my career and my ability to provide for the family. And so the seed was sown then, but much stronger than before. I'd always wanted to have my own business, but this was like a turning moment, I think. And at the end of that 6 months in the UK, we moved back to Singapore, and I had a plan. I was like, I've got to get another job. I've got to get a corporate job to pay and, to be in Singapore. It's an expensive place. I'm going to apply for permanent residency in Singapore, which means I could start my own business. So I had this very kind of set plan. Didn't know what the business was, didn't know, but was sort of on this path. And then, started work for this company that had a D&I leader, realizing I wanted to do that work, and then realizing this could be my business, and that I could do something that was really important to me. It aligned with my values, but that I could kind of take the shackles off and be a bit more challenging, I guess, with this work, and try to push it more than I could in a big organization.
That's fascinating, Lisa, and I my heart went out to you when you were sharing the story about what happened. Very, very difficult to hear that, but I'm glad you persevered. In starting your own work and starting your own business, I'm curious what kind of organizations you've worked with, what countries you've worked in, and what are some of the primary DEI issues you're seeing with the folks that you've worked with and in the countries that you've done the work?
So I've done a lot of work in Asia, and nearly all my clients are in Asia. They're either in Singapore, they're in Hong Kong, China. I've also done some work with some American companies, which has been really cool. So yeah, I love that. And I think for me, Asia is my second home. I'm currently living in Auckland, New Zealand, but I just love Asia, and I love the energy. I love the opportunity, and the diversity is incredible. I think the kind of work that I've been doing has varied a little bit. So, but I would say in some cases, the work is a bit more creating a base to build from. I look to the US, and so much work has been done in this space in the US, but I think in Asia, that work is still emerging, and it's, taking what we can learn from the US and the UK actually, and a little bit in Australia, and going, how do we apply this to a different context? And so it's often getting the basics in place. It could be making sure we have policies that are inclusive. So as we're recording, I'm doing quite a large piece of work on inclusive recruitment and promotion for a business headquartered in Singapore. I have done work where businesses are just getting started and they want to start raising awareness. And so they'll pick some of the, the international days or the international months. So I've done work through Pride Month, work for International Women's Day. Kind of bringing an outside-in perspective to organizations who are just starting to think about, what does this mean for our business? And then I've been really lucky, and it's interesting, I don't consider myself great with data or manipulating data, but I've worked on 3 projects now around self-identification. So providing the points in a HR system where people can identify themselves more broadly than gender or age. So race and ethnicity, or sexuality, or disability, a range of things. And that's been such interesting work, because in each country in Asia is so different, and the things that you want to capture might be so different, and the way the government's operating and setting up legislation or reporting from a government perspective is very different. So that work's been super fun, and I think probably the other part of work that's become really important in Asia is being able to translate DEI work from a head office that might be in the US or it might be in the UK, sometimes Australia as well. So taking that work, which has been developed in often a very different context, and looking at it and saying, well, what does this mean for us in Singapore? What does it mean for us in China? And sometimes it doesn't translate. Sometimes it does, and you can sort of manipulate it a bit. But I think really helping organizations in Asia make sense for them.
Do you happen to know, I mean, you've mentioned that you worked with some American companies as well. Do you happen to notice a difference in terms of the dynamics or some of the nuances of the DEI work between American companies and folks you've worked with in Asia? Or do you find just a lot of similarity?
Yeah, it's a little bit different because, I mean, we all understand the world from our perspective. So often when you're working with a US company, so I'll give you an example. So the self-ID work I've been doing, you know, when you're creating self-identification work at a global level, you know, you want to be able to report on something sensibly. But it gets really complicated because, like, you know, if I take race and ethnicity, you know, you might start with the main race groups that humans fall into, which could be Black or white or Asian. You know, there's a couple more. And then you start to break down, okay, well, what do we think exists in this country? And it's been really interesting to have conversations, particularly around Black, for example. So in the US, you will always have Black as a race group for people to choose from. In the US, you report on high-level race groups. So that's kind of easy. But then you come into, say, Australia or New Zealand. In Australia, the Indigenous people of Australia, if you call them Black, that's derogatory and it's offensive. And so you have this tension sometimes between different countries where something that's right in one country is not right in another country. And that can be really hard to understand and get. But, you know, on the basis, I think the same challenges exist in every culture and country. You know, issues of discrimination exist everywhere. You know, humans everywhere want to feel like they belong and that they're cared for. So, you know, there are these human things that exist across the world, but it's once you start to get into the detail is where you really have to understand what's going on.
And even I believe that there are some nations where it's actually prohibited from an HR perspective to ask some of those questions related to one's racial or ethnic identity, or I'm trying to remember, but we've definitely had some of those conversations with some of our international clients where they say, you know, we're gathering this data here in the United States, but we can't necessarily gather the same data in some of the other countries in which we operate. And so it's just making it more challenging for us to be able to figure out how to even identify goals that would, you know, that would indicate that we're making progress towards some of these DEI recruitment efforts, for example.
Yeah, yep, definitely. And some of the other challenges is that governments in Asia are still, like, there's lots of change happening on. There's pressure from within communities to change legislation, to do things differently. And so the data that you think you're going to collect now could be completely different in 2 years. And so particularly in the self-ID work, I'm always, you know, when I'm talking to organizations, it's like this government, so Singapore at the moment is signaling that they want to do more work around gender equity. Okay, so where do we think that's going to head? What does that mean for our organization? What data are we going to need to have? Yeah, so lots of changes in Asia, which is really cool. Like every, you know, month there'll be something different. The other challenge in the international context is, as you said, asking for the data can be really challenging. it's often not illegal. It's often illegal to demand to have the data, but if people voluntarily give it to you, that's usually okay. But there's countries where you don't want to be asking certain questions. There's parts of the Middle East and parts of Southeast Asia where being gay is not only illegal, but you could be killed. I mean, we see that in other parts of the world, but there's laws in the Middle East and Brunei that just mean you never want to put your employees in an unsafe place by asking that information. So,
absolutely. I'm also thinking about, kind of continuing down this continuum from a cultural norms perspective. In the United States, generally speaking, the sort of dominant culture is one that is deeply rooted in individualism and celebrating our uniqueness and speaking up and sort of questioning and challenging hierarchy. Obviously, all of this is comparative depending on regions and identities and even organizational cultures. But generally speaking, those are some of the things that we often think about in the US and with great reason. And obviously that is quite different when we think about some of the nations and the cultures that have been generally seen as more collectivistic in their societies. And so, and also just from the notion of power dynamics and hierarchy being much more showing deference and not challenging authority figures. And so I wonder how you've seen that play out in terms of some of the work that's been done or the practices that are often lauded within the United States as a part of our DEI work that may or may not translate when you think about moving from a more individualistic or more I use the term egalitarian loosely because I think sometimes in the United States we think we're much more egalitarian than we are, but when we compare ourselves to some of these Eastern cultures, how do you see those dynamics at play?
I see it in a few ways. And I mean, just practically when you live in some of these countries, the things that you notice. So, I moved from Australia, simple things like lunch. So I would often have lunch at my desk. I'd go out, I'd get a sandwich, I'd come back, I'd eat it at my desk, and I would keep going because I want to get through the day and I want to get home. I moved to Singapore. And it's like, oh, Lisa, do you want to come for lunch? And I'm like, oh, that'd be great. So 10 of us go to lunch. 10 of us go and we get shared food, which is great. So it's all, everyone shares. It's, and lunch goes, for much longer than I would normally have lunch. So, initially those things are funny. And even dealing with clients in Asia, you might turn up to discuss what you're working on, and there could be 8 people on the call because we've got to bring everyone. We're collectivist. And I think the way it works around DEI, it's, you don't, when you're in those cultures, you don't want to be seen to be putting your head up above everyone else. Being humble is very important. And that deference to hierarchy is really, really important. And I think where I've seen, a really practical challenge is where organizations in parts of Asia, for example, want to have in senior leadership roles. So they want to promote women into these roles. And I do a lot of coaching with women, and, sometimes the excuses and rely on that culture. And, I do understand the culture and I do understand the challenge, but when you're saying to women, so where do you want to go? What's the next step for you? It's like, I don't want to think about that. And when I start challenging them, they'll say, oh, but Lisa, that's not our culture to do that. And, my manager's more senior than me, and so I have to respect my manager. And I'm like, and so of course I understand all that, but then it's sometimes, are the women sometimes hiding behind that, and because it's much safer to work within what's established than to put my head up and say, actually, I do want to be in a more senior role. I do want to be promoted. I do have ambition. I just don't want anyone to know about it. So I think we see it that way a little bit. I've been caught up with, assuming that I have to defer to hierarchy as well. So I can remember moving from Australia, where very much like the US, individualistic. Australians do not respect hierarchy. We think we're all equal. If we get in a taxi, we sit in the front seat with the taxi driver, that kind of stuff. So I go into Asia. I'm the HR business partner, working with the managing director, trying to get a project done from the US head office. That was, I had to get this project done. It was really important, and it was changing the bonus that existed in Singapore to make sure it aligned with what we had in the US. And the managing director was a Singaporean man. I was trying to be very respectful. I was trying to be less Australian, less direct, be more humble, to try and get this project done. And so I worked at it for months. He wouldn't meet with me. He would change meeting times. He would avoid me. To the point I was like, this is not working. This is me trying to work in this culture in this way, and what I thought was right was not working. So I'm like, well, I'm just going to do the opposite. I'm going to be me. I'm going to be my Aussie direct self. And so the next time he tries to avoid me, I'm going to do that. And so I did. And from that point onwards, I could get the project done, and then he would come to me for things which he would never do before. He would take me out places like, so as with all cultures, I think there is a huge impact of the hierarchy and being in a collective culture and being able to navigate in that culture, but not always, I think I would say. And I guess it was me not understanding perhaps where I sat in the hierarchy. So that was a really interesting experience.
Well, it's always fascinating to me how sometimes the eventual communication that needed to happen was just getting through that initial misunderstanding or that lack of understanding of how we operate in order to really actually connect, right? And it was fascinating to me to kind of envision how that played out. And it actually reminded me of something else that is a dynamic I think that's very evident in the DEI world, and that is how folks respond to advocacy for groups, or the trainings that are made available for getting across the important learnings that need to take place. And I noticed that on your website you talk a little bit about kind of how some folks might respond from time to time when there is advocacy, for example, for equity, or for the issues that affect certain groups and identity, particularly gender is what you were referencing. And sometimes that the reaction to folks saying, some folks will react by saying, well, why do we have to focus on that identity? Why can't we just focus more on diversity of thought, which is actually something that is very prevalent here in the United States as well. And I'm curious how you respond to that, because I know in my experience, and I know Maria probably could speak to this as well, diversity, equity, and inclusion inherently is about a diversity of thought. It is interwoven into everything we do. That's what it's all about. But there seems to be an attitude or a perspective suggesting that by focusing on identities and the experiences of folks and their particular lived experiences, we might be limiting the diversity of thought there. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious how it plays out for you.
I'm pretty sure every person working in DEI has had someone say to them, but it's about diversity of thought.
Right.
I was in a meeting where I was debriefing it was a senior leadership team. They had done a 360, and I was debriefing the group report, so the summarized results to this group. And so I'm standing at the end of the table. I've got their group results on the screen, and in front of me is 9 white men who are engineers wearing blue shirts, and one Chinese man, I think he was also wearing a blue shirt. Yeah, and then I was the only woman, right? And so I'm debriefing the results, of course, that the summary is all exactly the same. The things that they're all good at is all the same. The things that they're not good at is all the same. At the end of the table, one of the white men who's an engineer wearing his blue shirt, like all the other white men who are engineers wearing a blue shirt, says to me, Lisa, it's not about diversity. I must have said something about lack of diversity in their results, and that they didn't have a balanced team to cover their strengths and weaknesses. And you know, this guy goes, Lisa, it's about diversity of thought. And I'm just like, you can't even dress differently. You don't have diversity of thought, right? And I think what's so funny about the diversity of thought argument is that to get diversity of thought, you have to have the diversity of experience. And I was talking with another DEI leader yesterday about if we have diversity, that's somehow a threat to you. So if we give someone who has a disability a job in our company, that's a threat to me. Or if we say we're going to focus on getting more women into senior leader roles, well, that's a threat to me because, you know, I can't have a career here anymore because you're only going to give women the jobs. And I'm like, it's not like it gets used up. It's not a pie that once we've given out all the pieces of the pie, it's not like that. Yeah. So I find that fascinating. And I think one of the things that has stuck with me the most in trying to explain why having diversity doesn't mean you lose because someone else gets an opportunity. The big engineering company I worked for, we had an incredible employee resource group for Black people in the US. They were an amazing group. They supported each other, but they were also doing great things for the company. They had an incredible amount of grace. I think it was the best example of grace. And one of the leaders said to me one day, not long after George Floyd was murdered, that Lisa, the thing is with, you know, because we're having lots of discussions about our Black people and how they didn't feel safe, and people were pushing back. You know, I had one leader say to me, Lisa, why are we talking about Black people when people are worried about losing their jobs? Like it was during COVID. And he said, the leader of the employee resource group said, the way I explain it to people is at the moment, we're focusing on Black people because people are being killed for no reason. And it's like when you have kids. When you have kids, you might have three kids and one's not doing well in math. So you focus on that child to get them better at math. It doesn't mean you don't love your other kids and you don't want them to do well. Of course you do. But there are different times when we need to focus on different things. And for me, that really explained or was a good analogy for how we can think about diversity and why we need it and how it drives diversity of thought. Did we get there?
Yeah, I think that's a marvelous example, and you said a lot of
Yeah.
great things there. And it was interesting because I would even add a little nugget that says that when you've always been the one getting the attention and the world seemed to revolve around you, and then you see others getting the attention, you feel like you're slighted, right? Even though you've always gotten the attention, right? So I just wanted to say that. And I also wanted to reassure you that it's only a coincidence that I'm wearing a blue shirt today. Just I wanted you to know that for our listeners and for you. So I want to put it out there. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
so funny.
it's so many great examples of the importance of being able to accept and explore the duality of this work, that it's not either or, right? And I think just to your points about this perception that it's a zero sum, that it's a pie, and somehow if we're giving somebody else a bigger piece, we're not going to get as much. And to what Roger was saying, that it's when one particular child, right, when one particular portion of the population has been on the receiving end for generations of systemic support and focus and reward, it's, it's not taking away, rather it is
No.
looking at how do we make sure that we're broadening, because then everyone gets that support and that sense of
Yeah.
belonging and the reward that they all deserve. So
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a great example of that here in New Zealand at the moment. And so the Indigenous people are Maori and Pacifica. And like many Indigenous populations around the world, their health outcomes are much worse than the majority of the population. And so the New Zealand government set up a health department just to address the health issues in the Maori population. Great. Awesome. But my friend, Lisa, I don't see why they need their own department. And I was new to New Zealand. I'm like, well, I don't understand New Zealand yet, but I understand Australia and the health outcomes for the Indigenous population in Australia. So they, don't live as long, have higher incidences of various lifestyle diseases, are incarcerated more often than the general population. Yeah, similar around the world, right? So why wouldn't we focus on a population that's doing less well to try and bring them up to everyone else? And she's like, oh, I just don't think it's very inclusive. And I'm like, but it's not hurting you. Like, white people like me, we get great healthcare. We get free drugs. Used to be $5 a packet of drugs, whatever you take. It's now free. If I go to the doctor, get a prescription, it's free. I pay a small amount to see a doctor. It's not very much. And we can afford medical insurance, which pays for everything else. Why do we care so much whether we're trying to help people who don't get the same access that we do? It's the pie thing again. Yeah. It's frustrating.
Also, can I just say, being an American citizen, we are very jealous.
I know, I'm sorry.
Of your
I'm so sorry.
Your health benefits, and also you were mentioning sort of parental leave.
I'm sorry. Do you know I've worked on projects?
Can you
on
adopt
maternity?
me? Can I come to New Zealand?
Come. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I'm so sorry about your parental leave and your healthcare system.
We're working. The
struggle is real.
Advocacy work. Yes, we're working on it. So I realize that sadly we are getting close to our time together, and this has been such a rich conversation. If there's anything that you could sort of leave our listeners with today in terms of tools or kind of a call to action, what do you think is most important for organizational leaders at any in any capacity, right? Not just people at that C-suite level, but leaders who care and want to make progress toward diversity, equity, inclusion. What do you think is most important for them to be focusing on, to keep in mind these days?
Yeah, I mean, being a leader in an organization at the moment is a tough gig. You're expected to do so much more than ever before. But I think, you don't have to solve everything. I think as a leader, you just need to be open and to take opportunities to understand other people's experience. We all want to belong. We all want to be part of something. We all want to come to work and feel good about ourselves. So, the leaders, I think, who do the best in this space are the ones who are not perfect. They make mistakes, but they're open and they're willing to learn and understand. So I think that would be, my biggest takeaway.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa Mulligan, for joining us. And we will definitely be putting information in the show notes for folks to be able to connect with you, to find you. And wish you all the best of luck. Hope to have you back on the show sometime soon.
Thank you. I think we're also going to put in the show notes a couple of freebies. So one is a document about some tips for driving gender equity in your organization, and a copy of my diversity and inclusion salary and market survey. It's last year's. I'm just about to release the 2023 version, but last year's was just for Asia Pacific. This year's for Asia Pacific and Europe. Haven't dipped my toe into the US market yet, but you never know. Yeah, so you can download those.
Thank you so much. That's so
Thank
generous.
you.
And thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your wisdom. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
No, it's been my pleasure too. It was great to talk to you both.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.